Good evening. My name is Jess, and I'm assisting Anita with the Jewish Literature program. And welcome again for the second installment of the Let's Talk About It series. Tonight we're discussing Mr. Sammler's Planet by Saul Bellow. And just a quick reminder that we are taping tonight's discussion again, and because we've got fewer people here tonight, I don't think we're going to videotape one table's discussion. I think actually we're just going to have more of a general discussion with everyone tonight instead of breaking off into smaller groups. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Matt Seminoff to the podium.
Good evening, and welcome again to the second installment of the Let's Talk About It series on Jewish literature, exploring the theme Between Two Worlds, Stories of Estrangement and Homecoming. Again, I'd like to thank the support of the Missoula Public Library for being able to host this discussion series and to also draw attention to the fact that this is a series that is funded by the Next Book organization and the American Library Association. And so without that type of funding, this sort of thing wouldn't really be possible. Again, my name is Matt Seminoff. I'm Assistant Professor of Classics in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and Literatures at the university here. So again, this might be a recap for some of you who were here last week, but this isn't necessarily my field of expertise, and so I'm hoping that a good, solid, open discussion will be productive for all of us. And finally, I'd like to, in terms of opening remarks, like to point out that the next book in the series is available for circulation, I guess, over there. It's Out of Egypt, and we'll be discussing that a few weeks from now on October 25th. And I think that book should come as a bit of a relief after reading Mr. Sammler's Planet, at least judging from my wife's reactions to it. She laughs out loud the whole time that she's reading it, so that it should be nice to have a little bit of a lighter book. So let's begin. This book is exceptionally challenging, and I'm willing to guess that many of us had a lot of difficulties getting through some of the more graphic passages, whether they were sexually graphic or just violent. And to be fair, it is clear that Bellow's novel was initially met with mixed critical opinions. James Harris characterizes the initial reviews as being either, quote, regarded as a small step forward for America, this by the right, or as a large leap backward for Saul Bellow, this by the left. One particular reviewer damned Mr. Sammler's Planet as a defense of tradition against modernism. Scholars still attempt to deal with the apparent racist and misogynistic subtexts in the book. The ideas presented in the novel are extraordinarily difficult too. Mr. Sammler's observations of the moral and social decay that surrounds him are tinged with bitterness and hostility. But I hope that you managed to bear with Mr. Sammler and made it to the end of the book. The end is extraordinarily powerful in its open-endedness. We are left with Mr. Sammler in the morgue, praying for his nephew, Dr. Elia Gruner. Quote, he did meet the terms of his contract, this is Sammler's prayer to God, the terms which in his inmost heart each man knows, as I know mine, as all know, for that is the truth of it, that we all know God, that we know, that we know, we know, we know. The prayer refers to a contractual obligation, a covenant, but it suggests that the terms of the covenant are determined by the individuals involved. There is no longer a single covenant between the people of Israel, the chosen ones, and God. These final lines suggest that Dr. Gruner has distinguished himself as an individual within a larger community, and so in at least one way resolves one of the tensions of ambivalence that pervade the novel. Saul Bellow creates a mythical character in Mr. Sammler. He is Tiresias, who, despite his blindness, sees more clearly than Oedipus. Vision stands as one of the major themes of the novel. Despite his partial blindness, the result of violence during the Holocaust, Mr. Sammler's vision intensifies at key moments. After witnessing the black pickpocket, he, quote, receives from the crime the benefit of an enlarged vision. And after witnessing the crime, the world, Riverside Drive, was wickedly lighted up. Wickedly because the clear light made all objects so explicit, and this explicitness taunted Mr. Minutely Observant Arthur Sammler. He experiences the same intensification of vision after witnessing the pickpocket a second time. Mr. Sammler's character is at least in part defined by his role as a witness. He is asked to testify, that is, to report what he has witnessed at the trial of Eichmann. He hurries off to Israel at the outset of the Six-Day War, not only as a foreign correspondent, but as a witness. The association with seeing and knowing is, of course, an important feature of the English language, despite the fact that we can no longer see an etymological link between seeing and knowing the way that you can in so many other languages. Through Mr. Sammler's observations, no less through his experiences, comes his wisdom. He has been trained to translate his emotions into, quote-unquote, piercing observations. But Mr. Sammler plays the role of another mythical character. He is Orpheus, Theseus, Heracles, and Odysseus, all of whom return from the land of the dead. He is Dante who, quote, midway in his life's journey went astray from the straight road and woke to find himself alone in a dark wood. Like Dante, Mr. Sammler stumbles into the dark wood. Returning to Poland from the safety of London, would he have been killed during the siege of London, we might ask? To take care of his family business. Mr. Sammler is the man who wrestles death and is victorious. This victory, however, is ambivalent. Sammler sees himself as a vestige, a visiting consciousness which happens to reside in a West Side bedroom. And despite his survival, his feats of valor, that would otherwise, in another time or space, characterize him as a hero, Mr. Sammler does not consider himself entitled to the outside honors. Mr. Sammler is different things to different people, but always a symbol or a touchstone. To Dr. Gruner, he is the last connection that he has to the old world, to his family. Mr. Sammler provides the history at which Gruner grasps. To the young radicals in his audience at Columbia, he simply represents a fossil, an irrelevant remnant of an age long past. His political impotence tied to his sexual impotence. He's a confessor to Brooke, to Angela, but he himself is guilty. As we read this novel, we see that the pre-war Sammler and post-war Mr. Sammler, or as James Harris defines him, Sammler the Younger and Sammler the Elder, are two different individuals with different ideas, different identities, and even different physical characteristics. Before the war, Mr. Sammler's Jewish identity was secondary. When Elia Gruner asks about Hesed, a man who is frequently called to the Torah and active in the synagogue, Sammler responds, "Well, you see, Elia, I didn't have much to do with the synagogue. We were almost freethinkers, especially my mother. She had a Polish education. She gave me an emancipated name, Arthur." Sammler grew up in a privileged household. He relied on a housekeeper to cover his mouth while sneezing. As a young man, he was studious, not meant for action. Before the war, he is proud of his British success. He participated in the Cosmopolis project for the World State, had written important articles, etc. But now, Sammler is doubly foreign, Polish, Oxonian. Sammler himself narrates the transformation to Dr. Lal, Margot, and Shula. Suddenly it was all action, blood, guns, graves, famine, very harsh surgery. One cannot come out intact. For a long time, I saw things with peculiar hardness, almost like a criminal. Sammler recognizes that his experiences are unique, and as a result wonders whether he belongs among other people. He questions his own judgments because they are based on personal experiences. but those experiences are so extreme, they have been abnormal. I assume I am one of you, he says, but also I am not. He is placed in an ambivalent position in relation to his family members, as well as to humanity as a whole. Earlier in the novel, Wallace suggests that he has probably seen too much. Who is Mr. Sammler? Is he a human? How is it possible that he has survived being hacked at, shot at? Who or what is this man who is partially blinded by the blow from the butt of a rifle, buried alive under corpses and earth, who clawed back to the surface, escaped to the woods, and, as a quote-unquote apparition, was rescued by a Polish undertaker who figuratively buried him again, living as a corpse for quote-unquote 3 or 4 months? The undertaker was prepared for the half-naked, famished, caked hair and beard crawling out of the forest. He has long experiences dealing with the dead. Is he alive? Is he human? This novel is about humanity and raises many questions about the nature of man. As Aristotle claims, man is a political animal. To Aristotle, this means that man's natural habitat is the polis, or the Greek term for city-state, but we are perhaps more familiar with the terms derived from Latin, civis for citizen, civitas, citizenship. Despite Mr. Sammler's urbanity, despite his polite demeanor, his sense of propriety, his willingness to politely listen to things that clearly disturb him, he lacks the status of citizen. He is not associated with a clear political organization. And moreover, he questions whether such organizations are something that we should even strive for. As he lectures to the students at Columbia, he reveals his former political optimism. He was involved in the building of a planned, orderly, and beautiful world society, abolishing national sovereignty, outlawing war, offering free universal education, personal freedom, a society based on rational scientific attitude towards life. As he lectures, though, he notes that it was a kind-hearted, stupid scheme. The post-war Mr. Sammler is unable to imagine a just social order, a non-corrupt society. Perhaps Wallace was right. He has seen too much. Perhaps Mr. Sammler is right. His judgments are perverted by the abnormality of his experiences. Throughout the novel, Mr. Sammler reflects on the social changes that surround him, often bitterly and with a certain amount of disgust. Is he entitled to those criticisms? His experiences through the war justify his reaction against the dream of social order. The Nazis wanted to establish a social order also, a perverse order at exceptional costs. And as he observes the loosening of cultural and social restraints that accompany the American Civil Rights Movement, among other movements, he wonders whether liberty and freedom are truly linked to the individual's ability to do as he or she wishes without regard for social conventions. It is clear, he comments, that this revolution, a triumph for justice in many ways, slaves should be free, killing toil should end, the soul should have liberty, has also introduced new kinds of grief and misery, and so far, on the broadest scale, it has not been altogether a success. We have fallen into much ugliness. It is bewildering to see how much these new individuals suffer with their new leisure and liberty. Mr. Sammler's comments, as critical as they sound, are offered out of sympathy, not rancor. At least that's what he tells us. The modern world, as Mr. Sammler sees it, is a struggle between the individual and the collective. It is a struggle between the unique and the shared, the original and the model, the hero, that is, in mythic terms, the hero, and the common. At the root of this struggle, Mr. Sammler observes that human beings, when they have room, when they have liberty and are supplied also with ideas, mythologize themselves. They legendize. They expand by imagination and try to rise above the limitations of the ordinary forms of common life. But in the quest to achieve this heroic state, modern man turns his back on the models of tradition, assuming, according to Mr. Sammler's line of thought, that the models create restraints and limits, that the models induce imitation, that they preclude creativity. But to Mr. Sammler's eye, at least his good one, the streets are filled with imitative anarchy. They sought originality. They were obviously derivative. People bought their personalities at the 5 and dime store. Mr. Sammler identifies Job's complaint to God as part of the root of the tension. What is man that thou shouldst magnify him? Job asks. And so man is faced with a dilemma: to strive to achieve greatness, to emerge from the faceless, undifferentiated masses of modern culture, to establish identity and individuality, but at the risk of the misery and despair, the pain of heart, the peculiar longing for non-being. In the end, as Mr. Sammler prays for his dead nephew, we see perhaps one resolution to this dilemma. Gruner has more than fulfilled his individual obligations. Although Mr. Sammler alludes to some of Gruner's flaws and faults, some of which may be linked to the desire to distinguish himself, ultimately he did simply what he had to do as an individual. So those are just a few opening remarks about how I read this character, Mr. Sammler. And since we have such a that's the word I was looking for, thank you, intimate group, I think we'll forego breaking up into smaller groups and just have open the floor for discussion. I've got 50 handouts. With a number of questions that we can start our discussion from.
Are your essays available online by any chance?
No, I'm afraid not. Not at this point. Perhaps in the future.
You will let us know.
I'll let you know.
We'll put it in the
I can email it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
You need one more?
Oh, yes.
You can leave some in the back too. Why don't we just begin by opening up the discussion with perhaps question number one, which is meant to more or less refresh all of our memories about what happened in this novel. So let's take some time to talk about the characters, who the major characters are, what some of their defining features are, what roles they play in the novel, and things of that nature. And then we can move on to discuss some of the other themes that we see. So outside of Mr. Sammler, who do we have that inhabits his world?
His
Daughter Shula.
And what is she like, Shula?
She thinks she's nuts.
He thinks she's nuts. Good. What else?
She has 2 different names.
She has 2 different names. When is she which name?
One is in Polish and the other is more anglicized.
Okay.
I noticed that was a question I had. He uses the 2 hyphenated early in the book, and then he drops it completely later on and just calls her Shula. And I wondered what kind of technique that was, or what was the purpose for it.
That's a good question. I didn't really track at what points he used the hyphenated names versus the single name, so I don't know that I noticed a pattern at all.
About
But
halfway through, and I'm not sure at what point.
did anybody else?
I could speculate, maybe. I mean, she's got the 2 names because she's Jewish and Catholic, really. I mean, she's this hybrid. And maybe, this is pure, towards the end, it's really about the relationship between the father and the daughter and how they're going to go on. So it's more just how he thinks of her, possibly, just her name. I don't know.
Right, no, I think, like, to him, she's Shula. That was the name he gave her. It's a Jewish name that she's his daughter. When he refers to her as Shula Slava, it's more like a third person. That's how she thought of herself, and which also certainly explains her inability to fit in with the world, because she was in 2 worlds of what had been, an amazingly traumatic time in her life. And bounces from one to the other as it suits her.
Let's tease out some more of those characteristics of Shula Slava. The
Strange dresser.
she is a hybrid, right? Where does her Catholic side come from?
She was hidden in the convent.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's right.
What else do we know about her?
She hoards things.
She hoards things. She picks things up all the time out of the trash.
Too much cleaning.
She's been married
But abused.
Good.
and was abused.
By a crazier person.
And had to be there had to be sort of an intervention to get her out of that relationship. She didn't take the action on her own,
Good.
which implies the combination with that and everything else, a kind of incapacitating view of herself and her place in the world. That when you say she's crazy, part of it is that she doesn't seem able to take the normal course of action that other people might take. She seems able to do these very sort of eccentric things, but when there's a course of action that one might expect a person to take in that situation, she's kind of paralyzed, she's not able to do that. She does something different instead.
Good. Any other features that we should talk about?
She seems to be, she also seems to be thinking about her father and concerned about his ability to take care of himself as he grows older.
And even to complete his life's work,
Right.
at least as she sees what it should be.
Yes.
Much more than he is.
Yeah.
That's right. And so it's an interesting sort of scene where at one point he asks her if she has read any H.G. Wells, and she says that she didn't finish the book, and he admits also that he hasn't finished the book. So it's a nice little detail.
Had any of us actually heard of that particular? I haven't heard of that book by Wells. It might be that it really is purely second-rate stuff.
Or
Maybe it's a figment of their imagination.
It's possible.
Oh, who else lives in Mr. Sammler's world?
His his cousin.
Good, his nephew.
Nephew. Good.
And his daughter, niece.
The niece who's the landlady, Margaret. Isn't that his niece?
Angela.
Angela is,
No.
Angela's the daughter, and Angela's brother is Wallace. And who's Margot, the woman that he lives with?
She said she was another niece.
She is by marriage.
A
Different.
niece by marriage. Her husband, who's passed on, is Usher, right? Okay, so what's Dr. Gruner's relationship to Mr. Sammler like?
He kind of takes care of him.
Financially.
Financially,
Benefactor.
he's right.
Dr. Gooder is.
But he wants him to be somebody he's really not. Everybody wants him to be somebody he's really not. So
Gruner wants Sammler to be somebody
he
who
wants him to be his link to the old world and to the Jewish past and.
It's family.
Gruner seems to be obsessed with genealogy. Well, maybe obsessed is a bit strong, but from Mr. Sammler's perspective, he seems to be obsessed by it, right? Because Sammler, for some reason, doesn't seem concerned about this family history in the least.
But he confused me when he was first introduced, along with many other things that confused me in the book. But I thought when he was first introduced, it seemed like he would be older than Sammler because he had this sort of taking care of him role, and he had supported his getting to America, and he paid for this. And for some reason, I didn't connect that it was his nephew, and it took me a while to figure out that he was, in fact, younger than him. He's a whole next generation down, and I thought that wasn't just poor plot reading on my part, that he is in some ways also, because of that interest in genealogy and the whole history of, he is an older soul than he ought to be in some ways.
The age difference actually is quite close. There's one, it's like 6 or 7 years difference, so it's not quite as big a gap.
It's not.
Where did he spend the war? He didn't have any of the same kind of experiences that Sammler had.
No, and Sammler was eventually,
and successful and wealthy and
Right.
Americanized.
and so Sammler was eventually rescued from a displaced persons camp, right? Again, probably suggesting that this is part of Dr. Gruner's MO, scouring lists of survivors. What else is Dr. Gruner's character like?
He did illegal abortions for the mafia.
Yes, he somehow made some money. It's hard to know exactly where that stash of cash comes from, because who are we supposed to really believe? It's not found where anybody thinks it's going to be found. And so we kind of have to wonder what the source of the money is. He seems to talk a lot about his old mafia connections, and to what degree can we trust those stories? But
Well, I was just going to point out, he mentions that he liked to go back to Greenpoint, or at least that's where he was raised with these Mayor Lansky and Lucky Luciano, and that he was flattered that they would come to him in their greatness, as it were. But he was also perplexed when he would perform these whatever duties, and he almost, I don't know, I got the implication that he pretty much admitted that he got something, but didn't know what to do with the money. And of course, his son and daughter both believe that he stashed it in the house. And I have to admit, I've got about a third of the book to go, so I didn't get all the way through it.
We don't want to spoil it for him.
That's all right, you won't.
Well, he's also in a line of work that doesn't have a cash flow associated with it. I mean, it shouldn't really be a surprise that mafia money, or no mafia money, he's well off. He's not a dabbler. He doesn't want to be a doctor, but he is a doctor. He works at it. He does the things that you do, and presumably gets the pay that you get.
He's a
And-
surgeon.
Normally with cash.
No, but he has other things to the house, and, the guy's obviously wealthy. And,
And his daughter.
and so, yeah, maybe all the mafia money's in the rolls, and maybe all the mafia money is stashed someplace other than a pipe. But there's still enough other money that it really isn't too much of a mystery, and it's not as though he depends upon the mafia for his whole income.
That's right, yeah.
He's not a mob doctor, he's a doctor, and he helps some buddies and gets some money from that too.
But I think the point of it is that he's not this saintly figure. It's to make it clear to us that there is definitely this other side to him, however you want to interpret it, that there, so maybe there's some guilt feelings, or there's, he certainly is generous to Mr. Sammler, and certainly to his children, who are nothing but a disappointment to him.
Well, I thought it was only his children who saw that mafia connection. I thought it was maybe just his children's view of him that was critical.
I think nobody else is a credible narrator. I mean, you can sort of believe what Mr. Sammler says, but anybody else, Angela, Wallace, Shula, Margaret, and even Ellie, I mean, everyone else has kind of their own agenda and their own spin on it.
I could be forgetting, but I thought it wasn't clear that that money existed. I mean, it was sort of put out there, people were looking for it, people were going to great lengths to find it.
They do
And-
find it.
Yeah, but we didn't, until she actually called her dad, Shula, and said she found it, I didn't know whether it existed or not.
It's right, because we don't really know if Wallace's imaginations of what his father's really been up to are reliable or not. I think it does have a lot to do with how reliable our narrators are.
Right, I'm not sure I believe that Sammler is that reliable a narrator either.
But I think
He does after all only have one eye.
But the other one works. I mean, are we just talking depth perception?
But as the reader, you see the book through his eyes, so.
Yeah. Well, in some extent, but you also get a sense that he's not consciously telling you things that you do find out from the book. I mean, like, he's describing Shula as being cluttered and so forth. his own thoughts are cluttered at that point, and he's not perceiving that.
Right.
It's only when he's given a chance to talk, and he's finally put on the stage to talk to Dr. Lal, and isn't able to say what he wants as succinctly as he can.
Then we realize that there's a question of his credibility.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, considering the themes of the book, maybe is the physician's role supposed to be considered, what, success in America with all the trappings of success or something? I don't know, the Rolls Royce, the big house. It's, a classic Jewish profession to be a doctor as well. I mean, he didn't make his money being, building skyscrapers, it was a doctor. I don't know, so maybe is that the theme of him being a physician and success and his ability to be what he said he was at the end, what prayed over him, that he did his role in some way. I don't know. Throw that out.
I think those are good points, that he, especially given the fact that he doesn't especially like being a doctor, and that as soon as he can stop being a doctor, he's quite happy to stop, and there is this sort of pending insurance claim against him, whether he really does qualify for disability or not. But he is sort of forced into a certain position, it seems like. He is forced into the sort of upper middle class role of a Jewish man in America, at least for that time period.
But he's also, I think your point's well taken, because he's also a foil in a way, because these two kids look to him for his survival, and so does Sammler and his daughter. And I think a huge theme of the book is survival. And I'll just say at the beginning, I was thinking Mr. Sammler, rational, enlightened, but then more and more images of his experience about, being shot and thrown in that grave and somehow surviving is just horrific. And it's survival, even if survival involves violence. And I think in the last part of the book, he implicitly condones violence.
How do you see that coming out?
And I was surprised by it. I think that he goads his son-in-law to hit the beautifully dressed black thief.
But he's the one who says,
I know.
Eisen, I didn't tell you to hit the man.
I know, but he did, I think.
What gives you but I think that we need to find what in the text
Because
gives you that impression.
Here's this guy who just got off the boat, is carrying around these heavy pieces of art, strange art. He's with him. He could have called the police. He could have talked to any of those crowd of people, but he picked this bizarre.
This is the wife beater, right? That we're talking about.
He picked someone with a history of violence to say, do something about it. That's where it really clicked in. I didn't think it until that point where I really thought that, because his whole struggle a lot of the way through was, what kind of society do we live in? One of brute violence or one of enlightenment? And I feel that he condoned it, and I also feel he was implicitly telling his daughter at the end to take the money, even though he wasn't.
Well,
Wow.
I think we should spend some time talking about violence, at least as a theme throughout the novel, because it is something that deserves a certain amount of attention. And we can kind of separate it away from survival, I think. So we can talk about survival as a theme and then talk about violence as a theme also. Violence seems to be something that's creates a schism between two different types of Jews in the novel. That there's the pre-war Mr. Sammler, who again is fitting within a role, the role of the intellectual, right, and as opposed to the the man of action. But Mr. Sammler flips and becomes a partisan pretty quickly within the Holocaust, so he turns to a life of violence also for survival.
He shoots somebody point blank.
That's right, and someone who's begging for mercy, and he doesn't give any mercy, right? So so there is this. We seem to see two types of individuals here: the intellectual, the man of words, and the man of action. And when Mr. Sammler goes to Israel to witness the war, I think we see again the same sorts of images of violence, the violence for the sake of survival. But I think it's hard to say whether or not, I think it's hard to determine whether or not Mr. Sammler condones that sort of violence, even knowing how important it is for the survival of the state. How do you react to a statement like that?
Well, it seems to me that one thing that in Poland there isn't too much in the way of sequence, but Bellow does put a sequence of events in this fight involving pickpocket. And since there's very little in quotation marks, it's kind of easy to skip through and see what Sammler is at least saying. In my book, this is page 289. He's driven up, he's talking to the driver about what's going on. And the driver says that Pfeffer is wrestling with somebody else. Sammler says, then I must go and see what it is. He gets out on the traffic side of the car, although the driver tells him that he shouldn't because he's going to get hit. Of course, he doesn't get hit. And then on the next page, some of you, Sammler ordered, here, help him, break this up. But that didn't do any good. All he feels is, gee, I'm old and foreign. Nobody's paying attention to me. It does sound like New York in 1970. And then he runs into his son-in-law. And Sammler says, let him give up the camera. Why doesn't he give it to him? And the son-in-law eyes and asks, well, how do we prevail on it? Sammler says, get a policeman. Of course, he's called the police before. He doesn't actually say police, but he does say get a policeman out loud. But I don't know English. Then help the boy. Eisen says, you help him. I'm new in the country. I'm kind of crippled. You're older, sure, but
Where are we going with this?
Well, where we're going is that he does not start with violence. He asks other people to help. He gets out himself to help. He's in some danger. He's ineffective. He asks other people to help. That doesn't work. He says, get a policeman. That doesn't work. He asks his son-in-law, help the boy. Not kill the attacker, but help the boy. And it seems to me that he's moving through a perfectly sensible series of stages, each of which fails. And I think that's quite different from saying that at this point he's embraced violence.
That's how I saw it.
Mm-hmm.
I was shocked at myself. I didn't expect it. It's almost a gut feeling. It isn't even so much in the text, but it's just, you get this feeling that because of him, it's almost a release. Because that pickpocket, he has quite a history.
But I don't think.
But
But I don't think that's it. The next thing that he tries to do is get Pfeffer to give up the stupid camera. He says, "Give him the camera, Pfeffer. Hand it over." And that doesn't work. And then he says again, "Let him have the stupid thing. He wants the film. Don't be an idiot." But that doesn't work. And then he says, goes back to the son-in-law and says, "Eisen, I asked you to do something. Let them do something." And he motions to the bystanders. Eisen says that. So Eisen separate them. And I agree that it's horrific that this whole series of things don't work. But it also seems to me that we can't accuse him of leaping to violence when he's trying in such a variety of ways to avoid violence. And that's what I think the quotations are.
I think that those are very valid points, and particularly once the violent act occurs, once the man's been beaten, the chauffeur comes out, right, and tries to get Mr. Sammler away. And what happens? It's Mr. Pfeffer who says, "I caught him in the act. Please wait a while. He hurt my throat." And Sammler says, "Nonsense. Don't put on agony with me. This is the man. He's badly hurt," referring to the pickpocket. So again, I think that it's hard to see in the text any indication that Sammler has encouraged the violent behavior.
He leaves too. But the police come. I think, don't the police come before he leaves?
And he seems to identify with the pickpocket having been hit in the eye just as he was.
I think, yeah, and so throughout the novel, it is true that Sammler seems to look on at the pickpocket as some sort of object of curiosity almost.
Obsessed? He was obsessed. I don't think curiosity is strong enough.
Okay. Perhaps he was obsessed with the pickpocket, but the pickpocket is a spectacle. I think that's the point that I'm trying to make. That he's interested in the act, the dress, the mannerisms of this person, and then it's only at the point where the pickpocket is on the ground and bleeding and about to be killed that Mr. Sammler sees a human on the ground. So I think that the scene is striking because it draws attention to the human as opposed to the object that the pickpocket was throughout the book up until that point. And it seems that the pickpocket is viewed as an object by pretty much everybody who talks about him or discusses his role. And Eisen, well, Eisen's not involved in any of those conversations, but Eisen doesn't seem to see a human in front of him. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I'm with him in the sense that I didn't finish the last third. But just out of curiosity, the whole place where he exposes himself, can we talk about that for a second? Just because if we're talking about the pickpocket, and like I said, so I technically don't know what happens in the end of the book, but that whole power thing, I guess, is also interesting, and maybe there's more themes there than I thought, but frankly, as a female, I think it's very interesting that one man exposed himself to the other, and as a female who, we're always told to be careful of, strange men and that kind of thing, but the whole thing between the two men is interesting to me, and maybe there's more themes there. I was just wondering, maybe we're just supposed to just go past that, but that was a very weird thing.
I thought so too.
Yeah.
I had the same feeling.
So
What did that lend to the book?
Well, I think it kind of explains it in the, I don't know if you read
In the introduction.
this part here.
Yeah,
It
pick up
says,
on
What's
Mr.
that?
Sammler's Planet was first published in 1970 and is very much a novel of the late 60s. Sammler's disgust with movements taking over campus and the streets, women's liberation, and black power.
Saul
think-
Bellow really didn't like those things.
He
That
said
was-
Sammler.
Hmm?
She said Sammler.
I know. And I say Saul Bellow didn't like those things.
Is that true?
And it was,
You know that?
yeah, I think it was pretty widely known in the 60s.
But don't you think that
It's a real
that
Chicago
is,
story.
that he's giving an example of how
the black people were coming into their power at that time, and he elected to demonstrate it in that mugger.
Yeah, me too.
I certainly agree that it's about power, but I think that it's set up because, I don't know your names, but because of the part you don't know about, what you just heard about, at the end. So I think that at the beginning, we have the pickpocket exerting some very kind of bizarre power, or trying to exert power over Sammler. And he is successful because Sammler is obsessed with him and then can't stop thinking about him. And whether he's thinking about him objectified or as a human being, I think one of the ways Sammler deals with the exposure is to continue objectifying him, because that could have been a very human moment. I mean, only a human being could expose themselves because they're clothed to begin with, et cetera, whatever. So, but I think it was about power. At the beginning there, he exerts the power because Sammler is in this really weird place, and this is so strange for him too. And then at the end is when now Sammler has the capacity to exert power over him. And it's only at that moment when he realizes that he can do that, that, as you said, he becomes a person. And I think the establishment there, maybe this is too obvious, has to do with going back to the Holocaust experience. And how many Holocaust guards or prison officials or people who worked in the camps went through the same process with the people there, as far as being able to exert their power by objectifying them, and then and there are stories of, redemption or whatever. So, I think all of those parallels played out, and it was weird, but it is, and also thinking as a woman, what's that moment like, for women? It's terribly power related. So huge,
so to speak.
Yes, ridiculous.
Yeah.
Yeah,
They
go ahead.
mention, I think it's in the introduction to this book, and it talks about the Sammler's racism and trying to help, just comparing people to animals. And he was a puma, and I can't remember what the other animals were, but again, we say dehumanizing them. And then at the end,
Where was this, Wendy?
in the introduction in this book, which I mostly got through, he talks about Bellow's use of animals.
We don't have that.
To dehumanize them.
years, 10 years.
And then at the very end, in the little thing that we got in the packet, it talks about how the fact that when Eisen beats him, it's with a bag of misshapen stars of David, which is not exactly subtle symbolism.
His trinkets, Eisen's trinkets.
What role does Eisen play in coming back to New York? I was completely surprised by that. He didn't seem to have a role until he fulfilled his destiny by hitting that guy with the stars of David. Yeah.
None of the other characters were going to take on this guy? They had to bring someone in, get that part of the story taken care of?
Well, it's a bizarre reunion with he and Sammler, though, too. It has to do something with, and I don't know what it is, but because Sammler's whole sense of Eisen is pretty one-dimensional as well, is that he was the perpetrator of violence on his daughter, and so, now he comes back and there's this little moment. Like, one of the things that happens there is that they speak to each other in Russian when this whole encounter is going on, and so he has a kind of connecting point with Eisen, too, that we didn't expect over violence, and that's, I don't know.
I think we also need to consider Eisen's character in light, as he shows up in New York at least, as in light of kind of the idea of the artist, which artistic movements and things like that seem to be another of Mr. Sammler's preoccupation. There seems to be some sort of suggestion that the ethical world or an ethical philosophy has been replaced with a philosophy of aestheticism. And so if we have Eisner now, who is up until this point been defined by violence, more or less, he comes to the United States to make himself as an artist, or to present himself as an artist, and again, it just sort of unravels into brutality. So I think that there's a lot going on with this sort of peculiar character who just seems to be dropped into Mr. Sammler's world after everybody's tried to avoid him, and he's trying to become involved with the family again, and Mr. Sammler seems to be the only one who doesn't want to have anything to do with him. But it seems to be this role as the artist that is part of the hinge there. But the idea of the pickpocket exposing himself demonstrates kind of the connection between sexuality and power that is also a theme that goes throughout the novel. And so it's not simply, using the phallus as a power object or something like that, but we see other people's sexual behavior that seems to be grasping at something, whatever it is. Angela doesn't seem to know what she's grasping for, but she is looking for something.
Why is she always described in the most sexualized terms? Angela.
Well, you said that's how she sees herself, and that's how he sees her.
And that goes right into the misogyny, possibly.
Right.
Yeah. Perhaps. I don't know.
I think it's interesting that Sammler is an observer. He watches so much, and he's an outsider. He's such at odds with the world that he's living in. It's just, he's an anachronism in many ways. He's a throwback.
Yeah, the question is, what is he a throwback to, though? Because he's been displaced throughout his entire life, not simply now as we see him in New York, but he's in London. What's he doing in London? And why does he belong there?
But he
And
seems to thrive in London, at least as far as his image of what life was
Yeah.
like there. He's had a huge change in his.
he was impressed that all these Englishmen, important people, accepted him.
Right, and he had money then and position that he didn't have in the United States. He had relative poverty in the United States as an immigrant.
He's dependent, if nothing else. He's a dependent.
Where he wasn't before. At least that's not the picture he's painting.
But he's climbing hard in England. He hangs around the Bloomsbury set, but the person who spends the most time with is Wells, who himself came from lower classes, and he's been trying really, really hard his whole life. But he doesn't hang around with Leslie Stevens' kids. He does some, but that's not. It's not Virginia Woolf and Leonard Woolf and those folks that he is around most. He is kind of on the periphery. I was thinking about somebody like Malinowski, who was also from Poland and also in England and also at about the same time. And trying to make it in anthropology and really doing wonderful work. But he was just, maybe not quite the thing. Or even Joseph Conrad, Polish also, right?
Yeah.
30 years earlier. Trying to be around and being good enough to be accepted, but Sammler didn't quite make it in England. Maybe if he'd stayed longer, maybe he'd not gone back to close up that estate. And in the other parts of his life, it struck me that he didn't quite, he never quite made of himself the success that he might have otherwise made. In Poland, yeah, he got away, and he actually did kill one German soldier, having overcome him first, but it wasn't as though he did, led a resistance or anything like that. And when he came to the United States, he did a little bit of, kind of desultory. He was a journalist. The guy was obviously brilliant and capable, and he was working at a profession on a sporadic basis that didn't require that. He didn't quite achieve what he could have there either.
We can even back up for a second, back to his time in Poland for a moment. He does survive the concentration camp, right? He does become a partisan and is, as you mentioned, successful in killing another German. That's the point in the war when even the Poles have decided that they want to continue killing Jews after the end of the war. So even though he's survived at that point, people are still out to get him, and then he's hidden in this tomb for 3 or 4 months, and after he survives that and starts writing letters to the guy who helped him out, the undertaker who helped him out, shortly after that, that guy also hates him because his anti-Semitism starts coming through. So there's really no point in his history where he has been truly accepted anywhere.
Well, not only that, but what's interesting to me is in this whole conversation, and maybe it's because of this book, but I don't know, we should be, I would guess, incredibly sympathetic to this guy. I mean, in so many books I've read, contemporary novels, there's a defining part, a situation of violence, say an accident where someone's child is killed, that defines the rest of the character for the entire part of the book. And here, look what this guy does. He claws himself up from where his wife is laying along with like a whole bunch of people in a pit, and I mean all this horrendous stuff. I haven't heard. It's just interesting to me that he doesn't seem to elicit the incredible sympathy or the incredible situation that it takes to keep living, just to keep living after that horrendous amount of horribleness. I was shocked by that violence, and it took a long time for me to get through it, even though, for anyone who's ever done anything about the Holocaust, we hear about this constantly. We see the photos and everything. To me, that was amazingly horrendous, and so here he is now kind of going through like a ghost, not like a living ghost,
Yeah.
but it's just interesting that he doesn't seem to elicit a lot of sympathy
That's right.
from us.
Just
I mean,
so-
or from the reader maybe in general. Maybe he's not meant to, but I thought that was
I think that's the point, and that getting back to the idea of survival, which is that just because you survive this horrific thing, it doesn't make you likable.
That's a good point. Right.
But it is, I think, a change in the direction of survival literature coming out of this tradition. That this marks a departure for Saul Bellow. I'm not an expert in Saul Bellow, but from what I understand, this book does mark a departure in the way that he's dealing with the survival narrative. So it is kind of interesting that we do have a difficult time identifying with him, if nothing, whether or not we like him. I mean,
Well, I have sympathy for his survival ordeal. I mean, it's so horrific that it just scarred him so deeply and marked him so. I mean, it's maybe, sort of touchy-feely kind of to say, well, that, it's some of his flaws are not his fault because he was so scarred by that experience.
I'm kind of wondering if he might be too interesting a person to be a good hero. Following up on what you were saying a moment ago, if there's some kind of a symbol defining event, characteristic, something where you can say, oh, so-and-so, and then give the explanation in 7 words, and you've got it. And maybe that leads you to think well of them, or to feel pity, or to despise them, but you're pretty well done thinking about them. And then they can become a hero, a villain, a tool of the narrative, if that's all they are. And with Sammler, his reactions, although often plausible, aren't necessarily predictable in advance. At least I wasn't, when he was about to say something, I wasn't always sure what it was he was going to say. And which isn't to say that I found it implausible once I came to it, but that he was a sufficiently complex character that it wasn't easy to just put a sticker on him.
Yeah, his reactions to different things were lots of times unexpected.
Do you have any examples that come to mind?
Well, I was thinking of when was it, I get them mixed up, was it Angela who had Angela the whore, who had the experience with someone, with a male, when she was on vacation or
Yes.
something?
Oh, the foursome in
Yeah,
Mexico.
and I can't even remember, but I think I was surprised at his reaction.
He didn't want to hear about it.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that he was ignorant or prudish, or I don't even think that he felt that it was an improper subject of conversation. It was simply a conversation that he did not want to have.
And it wasn't appropriate for the particular time with her father having a screw in his neck or whatever. Yeah, just about to die at any minute. And all he wanted really was for her to try to reconcile without sort of drawing any attention to what she's reconciling for. And just, he's about to die. Just accept that and reconcile. And she was unable to really do it. She became very offended that the conversation was even taking place.
The whole book to me was just like, what?
It's a tough book.
Yeah, because, there were so many strange things that happened. You think, how many strange things can happen in the same book, you know?
And we haven't even talked about the moon yet.
No.
Well, do you think, this book won the National Book Award. Bellow won a Nobel Prize. As I was reading it, I didn't read the introduction until after I finished the book, but I don't think it stands the test of time. I think it's very dated, the way he's dealing with the movement of the 60s, and obviously this is a reaction, I assume, to women's lib, because he certainly has a low opinion of women. I don't know. As just literature, forget the themes and the kind of point of this discussion. Does anybody think it's a good book as a piece of literature?
I kind of liked the way it showed different things without telling you them. It showed his interior thoughts and so forth, but they weren't necessarily the actual reality. You had to infer that from his perceptions.
Yeah, I would certainly say, I think it's a quality piece of writing, and I think it's very intricately crafted in many fascinating layers. Did I enjoy reading it? No. But the book awards are not given based on my enjoyment. So I would say I didn't feel like it was dated. It certainly is set in a specific time, which is important for Sammler, but I think that I don't think that the things that Bellow chose to say about various movements were the purpose for his writing. I think they were vehicles for the other things that he was trying to get us to think about, and it's set in a particular time, as many books are. So I wouldn't.
I thought it was interesting by the end that he and Shula were kind of scarred by their experiences and were kind of disabled in some ways. And yet their relationship was stronger and better than Gruner's relationship with his children. And I think a lot of that he was bringing out to criticize Gruner's children, Wallace and Angela. From their, they've been allowed every advantage, and yet they have not been able to use them.
Well, their entitlement almost prevented them from recognizing what they had.
Or their competitiveness with their mom.
I don't know, I thought that I thought the writing was brilliant, just brilliant. I can still remember the way he described Angela's legs in her stockings. And I have to say, for me, in terms of the 60s and the movements and everything, there just seemed to be some stuff that was dead on. So for me, I didn't feel it was that dated, even looking back. And some of his descriptions in the comments My mom's from New York, and I spent a fair amount of time there, and so it's very New York too. But yeah, I would read him again, just because there's some of those lines, I can still see them, some of the descriptions that he made, and then of course there's the bigger characters. When Shula comes down in that Indian outfit,
It's hilarious.
It's hilarious. You can see with like the lopsided spot in the middle of her forehead. I mean, what a weird thing. It's like out of Carol Burnett, even though, and it's just a fleeting moment, but it was just like, it was this right on, and it was this weird.
She has the Ravi Shankar albums upstairs.
Right.
She's listened to them.
Like her lopsided lips, colored orange lips. I mean, I can repeat some of those lines that are just, I don't know, for me personally.
Something was wrong with the bust.
Right, that's
Wrong
right. She's
with
missing
the
the,
bust.
right. And the thing that's so interesting is here's a man who notices in such amazing detail. And I would just like to say that there's not that many men, I feel, in this world in general, who notice with such amazing detail of only one eye. Now, of course, he's our narrator, but I found that description, that part of it interesting too. So
Well, he had just seen her naked.
that's
right
true.
before that, right?
That's right.
By
That's
accident.
right.
His favorite moment
I want to go back to something that, I don't know whether you said it, maybe somebody said that it seemed like it was a dated and also a book of the period. And as I was reading it, the scene at the end of the first chapter where the guy exposes himself, did anybody else think about Soul on Ice, which had been published 2 or 3 years before this book?
What's Soul on Ice?
Soul on Ice is, Soul on Ice is a set of polemical essays written by Eldridge Cleaver. I think it was published after he was out of prison, but he was in prison when he was doing a lot of the writing. And it was his big make me famous kind of book.
It's
You
mentioned
describe
in
black
the,
penises in it?
in the
Yes,
introduction.
absolutely, which he
mentions that in the
redefines as
introduction.
rods.
Okay.
Oh, hey, how about that?
Yeah,
I bought
you
that
didn't
edition
have
of the book.
But he has a different issue. You didn't
And
see
Cleaver
that.
talks about going around raping white women as a gesture of power. And Cleaver was very much a big counterculture guy, and Saul Bellow and Ed Levy and Edward Shills and a bunch of other people at Chicago very distinctly were not. And he arranges for somebody to bash Eldridge Cleaver on the side of the head with chunks of iron at the end of the book, and that's his answer. To say that it's very much a book of its place and that it's actually involved in a bunch of arguments, and I think it is, and probably a whole bunch of things that I don't think we notice. It doesn't disturb me that a book is like that, but I do agree with you.
Which, because I said I didn't think it was dated. Wendy thought it was dated. I said
And then I
thought it was
agreed with
dated.
Wendy, I disagree with you.
I thought it was
Golly.
set. I thought it was set in a particular time and deserved to be there, but that was okay. I didn't say it was dated. To me, dated says that it isn't dated. That when I think of a book as dated, I think that the themes are not able to transcend the specific time in which it's set. And I thought that this book did that successfully.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The themes of the book are still timeless and relevant, and to my mind, it's when you have these sorts of criticisms of movements like the Black Power movement or the sexual revolution or anything along those lines in this novel, at least, that we still have to pit that criticism against the existing criticism for any other sort of legitimate or traditional political movement, which Sammler is equally critical of. And I think that the dilemma is where does liberty exist? Where does it exist at all? And if we release ourselves from these sorts of traditional gender stereotypes or racial stereotypes or something like that, does that mean that we'll be more free? And I think that question is still extremely important today, that you can see the movement at work, and it's almost as if Mr. Sammler has some sort of distance, that he knows that even though this is moving towards a good end, something that he very clearly wants to happen, he wants to see these increased freedoms, but he is doubtful that it's possible. And so I think that phrasing the dilemma in that sort of way is one of the features that makes the book timeless. I think it's also very interesting to see how we're still very much part of this sort of struggle to identify ourselves as individuals, and yet that we're plagued by kind of a monoculture, and I think that it's almost prescient the way that Mr. Sammler sees everything as an imitation and copy, despite the fact that we're trying for individuality, and yet it seems like it's getting to be even worse. The same sort of issue. How do we distinguish ourselves from one another? What makes us unique? Is it fashion? Can we dress in a way that makes us unique? No, of course not. Because then you just go to Old Navy or whatever, and everybody's wearing the same T-shirt, even though it's unique. It's like some surfboard T-shirt, whatever. But I think that those sorts of issues are what makes that keeps the book from really being dated. It's dated in the sense that it is heavily grounded in a particular time and place, but it's not dated in the themes that it raises. Thank you. Yeah, totally.
One of the things that made this, for me, so difficult to read is the sentences went on for paragraphs. And I'm used to making my own sentences a lot shorter about, well, it's hard to read it. When you go for a whole paragraph, you go, well, what does this sentence say? What is he? And he has so many ideas woven right into that one sentence. I want to give you an example.
Have you read Henry James?
Yeah.
That's hard for me. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Joyce.
I'm trying to see what the sentence starts. He saw the increasing triumph of enlightenment, liberty, fraternity, equality, adultery. And then that's one sentence. Enlightenment, and that's not even necessarily sentences sometimes. Enlightenment, universal education, universal suffrage, the rights of the majority acknowledged by all governments, the rights of women, the rights of children, the rights of criminals, the unity of the different races affirmed, social security, public health, dignity of the person, the right to justice, the struggles of 3 revolutionary centuries being won while the feudal bonds of church and family weakened and the privileges of aristocracy without any dues spread wide, democratized, especially the libidinous privileges, the right to be uninhibited, spontaneous, urinating, defecating, belching, coupling in all positions, tripling, quadrupling, polymorphous, noble in being natural, primitive, combining the leisure and luxurious inventiveness of Versailles with the hibiscus-covered erotic ease of Samoa. That's one sentence.
So the question, if I were teaching my students right now, would be,
Why did he do that?
why did he do that? I'm asking you.
It's just very hard for me to know what he's
No, but why did he do that? What does that tell you about Sammler if that's a sentence out of his head?
He didn't know any grammar.
Yes, that's it. No.
But it's a list, though.
It's a
Grammatically,
list, but
it's a
all the
fine
time.
sentence. It's a list, and maybe the list goes on longer than our memory is really suited to interpret it. But but the reaction is, my response to a sentence like that is, this guy it's a diatribe, and he's so caught up in his observations and his reaction to it that it's, if I didn't like Mr. Sammler as much as I do like him, I would say that he's ranting and raving. But it seems like that there's a specific emotional response that the author is trying to elicit from that type of sentence structure.
And I think he's trying to make sure that you're constantly inside the character's head. just as you're seeing what's happening to the character, what you're reading a lot of the time is the internal dialogue, which we don't punctuate very well, most of us. Some of us write as if we do, but most of us, when we're thinking, we're really not thinking in clear, nice 15-word sentences.
I found the last book that we got, the first one, I found her doing the same thing. She would have a narrative, and it would be easy to follow and be descriptive and so on. Then she'd launch into a similar stream of consciousness, if I could borrow a phrase. And she'd go on and on and on for a page and a half, and then she'd, oh, okay, now I'm back to the story. And
She was a
found-
little more linear than me.
Yes, that's true, but both of it's very difficult to get into, or to stay with, I should say.
Well, but from the author's point of view, I mean, Bellow is writing this for a reason, and so presumably he wants his readers to have to work hard at this book. I mean, he's not making it easy for you.
Why would an author want you to have to work hard to understand what he's saying?
Makes you think.
Because he thinks,
Not just
Makes you think.
It purposely slows you down
And a spoon
also.
feed.
Oh, it slows me down terribly.
But I think that that's a deliberate choice on the author's part to slow the reader down, that this is not something that's meant for consumption over a couple hours.
Because he's
This
trying to
isn't
impart
Stephen King's.
ideas as well
That's
as
right.
tell a story. And when he launches in, you really have to read every word, otherwise you can miss something important. And you have to focus, and sometimes it's really easy to kind of drift through those, but then I made myself go back, and it was work. But I felt it was integral to not just the story, but to this, knowing this narrator to a certain extent, knowing this character. But it wasn't easy, I agree.
Every time I put the book down, I had to go back quite a few pages before I could catch where I was before, and kind of, then I could go forward. It was very tedious to me. It's not enjoyable reading to me.
Well, I think in some ways, I mean, there's not that much thought in the book. I mean, there's a structure that he hangs it on. And I did notice when I was, granted, I was trying to read it quickly, because this was the last book I read, because I wanted it to be the most recent one for book club, and I maybe didn't time it quite right. But when things were actually happening, when he was traveling someplace, when they took the drive out to New Rochelle, I mean, then I found myself just moving right along. But when most of it is sort of almost like a treatise, that you had to slow down and kind of try to read each word, which kind of went against the grain. But I agree with Tova, I back up. Every time I pick up the book, I think, oh, I don't remember this, and I'd have to go back 3 pages to.
But he saves it, and he puts in some funny scene like talking about living on the moon or the house flooding or something, so that it kind of draws you back into it.
Wendy, you said earlier that he was very much anti-feminist or anti-woman. I forget which you
Well,
think.
the thing it quoted against the women's liberation.
Okay.
That he certainly did not seem to have a high opinion of women, at least in his
I
book.
don't think Bellows did either.
Which men did he
Yeah.
praise?
All of them.
No.
I didn't
don't
see
think so.
that in Sammler.
I think that
Especially,
the
yeah.
Indian scholar, he thought well of. Is it Dr. Law?
Yeah.
That was the.
And Dr. Brunner.
He was critical of Dr. Gruner also.
Gruner was, he
Not significant.
didn't amount to too much. He had money, he couldn't maintain an interesting discussion.
He was always interested in pleasing people, and he seemed to be a bit of a poser or something along those lines.
And he had mafia connections, if you see that as a minus.
you know, I noticed something, it really isn't that important, but I thought it was kind of interesting. I don't know how many of you have read Out of Egypt yet, but there's a character in there called Uncle Billy, who, when the family gets down, feeling down, he has a pet phrase. He says, he tells them, you know, that things are going to be fine, and then he says, you know, we are who we are we not? And that goes on all through the book. And in this one, I noticed that Dr. Gruner, it says Dr. Gruner was a toucher. His habit, even in passing through a room, was to touch, to take people's arms, even perhaps getting medical information about their muscles, glands, weight, or the growth of their hair. He also implanted his opinions, his hopes in their breasts, and then, if he said, "Well, isn't it so?" it was indeed so. And I thought those two characters were very much alike. They sort of shored up their belief in themselves and gave them some hope.
We'll have to keep that in mind for
Yeah.
next time.
It's a little creepy.
The next one's easier to
Yeah, we
read.
can assure you the next one is much easier to read.
Right. Very
I've heard
good.
good
I
things
thought.
about the next book. It's good. This is the second Saul Bellow I've read, and I think I will never read another one. I'm too busy a person to spend that much time plotting through. It doesn't give me pleasure.
You know, it's really interesting because actually Naomi and I discussed Out of Egypt with another group, and we won't go into it except to say that Bellow and the similarity is that it depends on how you come to it. I mean, if you come to this expecting a story, it will be tedious. And I admit, like I said, I really enjoy reading it. And I had read other Bellow that had a more compelling story to me, and I can't remember which one. I read several when I was in college, and I remember liking them, but feeling like it had was a little more plot-driven. And so I don't think, as you were saying, the plot didn't carry me along, and so that I guess I sort of was willing to let go of it occasionally. If I hadn't read it for a while, and though I did read it kind of in a chunk because I read it this summer, I just kind of read through it. You know, I didn't have to put it down, so that helped. But I don't think it's meant to be a compelling narrative. It's compelling something else. It's a character study. It's a thought provoker. I think he wants you to be thinking about these people and their relationships to each other, not what they do, but how do they get along, and how are they all touched by the various things in their lives. And
what's the right way to live? That
What's the
seems
right-
to be
yeah.
a big question.
You know what the definition of a classic is, don't you? It's a book you're glad you have read.
Is that what you teach too? It's a classics
I'm
professor.
heartbroken to hear you say that. Let's change the direction a little bit of the conversation, just a bit.
Sorry.
Since we are talking about these books in series, and we just had a nice sort of transition into what might be another thread to continue into the conversation next time around. But let's try to look backwards a little bit also, because we did hear, Dick, you mentioned that you saw that the writing styles between this and Lost in Translation were similar to a certain degree. Let's try to explore whether we see other similarities between the two books, because both of them seem to be set in approximately the same time period, right? Or at least part of Lost in Translation deals with the same overlaps here. Both of them are dealing with immigrants from Poland. What other sorts of comparisons can we make about the two
We have
books?
to really talk about Judaism, sort of low-keying it in both of those books. I mean, at least in terms of observant Judaism. I mean, I think all these characters are very intrinsically Jewish, but not from the standpoint of religion necessarily.
The idea of survivors
Survivors,
in both books, I think, are similar.
Feeling outside of the world that they were in, looking on and analyzing words and.
Yeah, go
But
ahead.
I was following up on what you said. I felt like she kept describing herself as outside, and yet we, at least in our group, felt that she was actually quite well integrated by the end of her life. I mean, she was really very
By the end of
by the end, you know. And whereas Sammler doesn't quite seem to talk about his distance, and yet he's terribly distant from his society. So his perception of himself and his world, he's created this planet that he believes is the way he sort of ought to be in it, whereas she's continually looking at it and wondering, and have I really entered into this world? It's an interesting contrast.
And they're both writers, right? She was literature professor, he was a journalist. But
He, of course, is fictional. There is that.
Yeah.
Let's assume that the memoir is also fictional in some regards also.
We know
so-
her as a child.
Yeah.
You see her develop and also obviously the acquisition of this new language. Mr. Sammler, I mean, he refers back to his time in London when, I mean, if you do the math, I mean, he still had to be in his, 30s? In those, I'm not sure what years he was in London, but, so we're talking more than a generation apart, these two. I mean, would we have called her a survivor, Ava Kaufman?
I think
Her
that
parents were, but
we discussed that a little bit last time also, is that Ava in the memoir had some sort of nostalgia for Poland, but her parents seemed to be separated from Poland and lacking that sort of nostalgia. And so I kind of wonder about Mr. Sammler. He doesn't seem nostalgic at all.
I think he's a little nostalgic for London.
I think he sees himself as the way that he describes his project to when he's giving that lecture. I think that it really makes it sound like he thought himself to be young and naive, and that he's very critical as an older man of ideas and intellectuals, and is not too tolerant to discuss this idea of the banality of evil, or to discuss what, whether a person confronted, about to kill another person, whether to see a look in their eye is sufficient to stop the act of murder from using that story or that event from Tolstoy. He's not too tolerant of people who come at things from intellectualism, it seems. I don't think that he's too nostalgic for London in those days, but that's sort of my impression.
But hasn't he earned that right? I mean, he had a trial by fire or whatever. I mean, he had obviously intellectual pretensions, and he saw the futility of that. If anyone's earned a right to be cynical about mankind or the future or whatever, and there's, I mean, I thought it was the best line in the book about like many who had seen the world collapse, he knew it could happen again. Which I would think, talk about altering your worldview.
In fact, he was kind of waiting for it to collapse again.
And he didn't put much stock in any of the big social movements, either of his immediate period or the communism or the common man. He seemed to mock those quite a bit.
The distinction in between the two books, I think, is that she seemed to have great trouble with language. That was the whole premise of her being able to come to grips with English and the thoughts behind it, whereas Mr. Sammler didn't show any problem with that. Of course, one is fictional, obviously.
Right. He wasn't preoccupied, at least,
Yeah.
with it.
And seemed to get along well in Oxford.
Well, he talks quite a bit of the disdain about Freud and the individual in some ways, and this whole idea of finding yourself, and she was totally into that, right? She was,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So those two were very opposite in
He was
that
very
way.
self-critical. After that lecture, he kept saying, okay, I'm an anachronism here. I'm out of date, and I'm a fool, and et cetera, and I deserve all of the criticism that he got from the students. Self-deprecating.
Yeah, there's name dropping throughout, anyway, by Bellow. it's like, look how smart I am. I know all these people and all these writers and all this stuff. It turns me off a little bit.
And now that's a very interesting comment, because doesn't he accuse Dr. Lau of being overly involved in credentials and
Yeah.
dropping names? So so that is interesting to point out. So along similar lines, this is question number 4 on the sheet. Neither book apparently has a whole lot to do with religious aspects of Judaism. Both of them are considered Jewish books. Saul Bellow considers himself a Jewish author. What is the role of Jewish identity in Mr. Sammler's Planet? Or what does it mean to say, for example, that a character is clearly Jewish, and yet, and what gives us that impression? I mean, I think it's true that these are all Jewish stereotypes. So these characters are Jewish stereotypes of different varieties, but what? How do we know? What makes us know?
He discusses Dr. Gruner's faith and his practice to some degree when he's in the hospital. Beyond that, I don't recall him talking about his own Jewishness.
Well, his experience in the Holocaust marked him as a Jew, whether he wanted to be or not,
Sure.
I think. And a lot of who he was shaped by that. But everyone seemed vaguely kind of old world European to me. And just the way they were about food and being a doctor. I mean, sort of these almost Jewish stereotypical touchstones through the book.
I thought in Bellow's book he mentioned Job at one point, very tangentially. But it seemed to me that his experience was sort of the opposite of that he had gone through this trial, and instead of bringing him closer to God, he moved away from God.
I think a lot of
lost faith in any, he still had some kind of moral idea that you could try to continue to work toward what was right, but it wasn't a religious idea.
I think, unfortunately, a lot of people that write about the Holocaust seem to have lost their way with God. It's such a horrific feeling of abandonment.
I've asked my husband this several times, read both books, but I can't see what makes them Jewish. As far as I'm concerned, they could be about just a person of Poland, or they could be about anybody that goes through a horrific experience and has to move from one place to another, or the hundreds and thousands of people that are in concentration camps and have to begin life anew, and they are of other religions. So my question to you is, what makes these, I mean, why do you call this Jewish literature?
I'm going to
That's
defer.
I don't mean that in a bad way.
No. First of all, I won't take offense at any of the comments about what books are read or not, because I had nothing to do with what books we read. This landed in my lap. So
I'm enjoying the books.
yeah.
I'm just wondering.
That's a fabulous question.
And that's really at the
It's a
root
good
of the question that I'm trying to ask here, is what it does make these things Jewish books, Jewish literature.
It's impossible for me to answer that, because I couldn't conceive of him as anything but Jewish. And I think that the Jewish people reading the book, oh, of course, he's Jewish. I know people like him. And I couldn't define it for a second. I couldn't pick out little pieces. I didn't pick up the Job reference. But, yes, I know Gruner talks about it. The prayer at the end is familiar. There's some elements of actual prayers that you say when somebody's dead, et cetera, et cetera. But that isn't it. It's just a whole personality. It's a cultural thing. It's like there's no question in my mind that these are Jewish books, but I couldn't analyze it. I mean, if I had to, if I were you, I would be able to. So why are they Jewish books?
Well, I would say I agree with you.
Jewish
that
authors.
Yeah, but that's not enough, I don't think, because there are all sorts of Jewish authors out there who aren't writing Jewish books.
Yeah.
But I would say, if you read this book, if you didn't know anything, if you even maybe took away some of the reference, I don't know, buying Yahweh's and Sabars or whatever he was doing in New York, but I mean, to me, I agree with him.
Yeah.
He couldn't be anything but. But
There's
I'm
an
not trying to say the
intangible
same thing about
aspect of it.
Ava Hoffman. If I didn't know any of the background there, and I was just reading this book as a memoir, I don't think I would know.
She could have been
Oh, yeah, you
from
knew she
some-
was
just-
Jewish.
Just a Polish.
But
Right, I mean, if you took out certain references in
Sure.
that book and just read it, I think, I kind of agree with
I would agree with that totally. I had the same sort of experience. Short of if we took out 20 pages, say, of Lost in Translation, we could remove any sort of hint of a Jewish element quite easily, without losing a whole lot of the development of the memoir. And I think that it might have something to do with the fact that she is at first transplanted into Vancouver, and Sammler is in New York City. That might have something to do with it, but
Well, and her nostalgia is for Polish life. It's not for.
which is something that
Not necessarily
I've never
Jewish.
heard of any Jew nostalgic for Poland who's one who's survived the Holocaust. Certainly, I mean, that's. I
Part
don't know.
of my question would be, how do you define Judaism? Do you define it as a culture, as a religion, as a place where people live? I mean, Israel is a Jewish state. I think all of those are true. And so, I mean, some people would answer that same question in different ways. And when you think about it, to me, it's a religion. Yet, because, for example, we allow conversion from anyone that wants to convert. We make it difficult for them, but it's not a nationality, even though we're all, at the time of conversion, you become a child of Abraham. It's a process that you're accepted as a Jew.
Well, at its root, it's a religion, and it was originally a religion. But we just
So many people don't
we
treat it
just
that
finished
way.
Yom Kippur, right?
Yeah.
I ate like a pig, like I always do. I did not go to synagogue. I went to work, but I feel so Jewish, and I'm totally identify that way.
Years ago, and maybe most of you know this, but when my son was looking into these groups and got this book, and it talked about, the rabbi wrote the book, and it might have been Kushner, but I'm not positive, and he starts off saying one of his first classes in seminary, the rabbi said to the students, name 10 Jewish people, and they started naming, Einstein and things like that. And then he'd say, well, now what synagogue did they go to, and how did they practice their religion? And none of these people that they had named were religious in any way, and yet they would have thought of themselves as Jewish, the world would have thought of themselves as Jewish. And then this author goes on to talk about how Judaism, or the children of Israel, were a community first that became a religion. So whether you're religious or not, you are part of this community, whereas other religions, I'm quoting him or paraphrasing, other religions, you are part of the community because you believe the same things. And that's what made Judaism this community that existed with or without religious ties. And I found that, I never knew that before. It really kind of struck me.
Makes it more
Let's
of a
pass that
culture.
along.
It's all of the above, though. I mean,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah,
in its
right,
own
when
way.
you said, is it this, is it that?
No, but I raised that as trying to somehow explain partly why these books are Jewish, in the sense
Yeah.
that they're not, quote, religious Jewish, but they are, like Naomi just
You're
said,
recognizably Jewish.
yeah, there's something, there's an undercurrent.
Well, we
So-
are reading these in Missoula, Montana, where the Jewish culture is not what you call dominant. And so it would be possible to,
The Jewish culture is not dominant just about anywhere, though.
no, but it's more dominant in New York City or even in New York. I mean, there are places where where your overall awareness of Jewish culture might be higher than if you were born and raised in Montana.
In New York City, for instance, I think on Jewish holidays, you don't have to change your parking for your car. I think certain holiday things apply, even though
Schools could be closed.
probably, or,
Well, they were. I mean, I went to school in New York.
oh, so they were closed.
They were closed on the high holidays. It was a given. You didn't have to call in. I had to call in to tell my daughter wasn't coming to school that Monday. It's just a whole different world.
One of the things I wonder about is what things people see that Bellow did to explain the Jewishness of characters. And the two things that come to mind, 2 or 2.5 things that come to mind for me strike me as an externally imposed definition of Jewishness, rather than something that is either springing from a Jewish community or from an individual character. And the examples that I have in mind, Gruner's mother insisting that the proper profession was to be a doctor. In the Holocaust, the Germans and Poles, in somewhat different times, imposing on Sammler the definition that he was Jewish, and therefore they were going to do as many terrible things as they could to him until he couldn't squirm anymore. And arguably, the fact that when Sammler was in London, in a fairly anti-Semitic intellectual culture, that his link was with someone at the bottom social edge of that culture. And again, that struck me as something that was kind of externally imposed. So is there internal stuff that other people see about characters, or Jewish community stuff?
Look at the very end. He's saying a weird version of the Kaddish in English, kind of. I mean, he's praying to God. He's acknowledging that God exists. He's talking about the idea of a contract, which is huge in Judaism, the idea of a contract between the people and God. And the Kaddish really affirms the existence of God. It's not about death, but for that is the truth of it, that we all know God, that we know, that we know, that we know. I think that's very much.
Sounds like Gertrude Stein.
I think to me that's a version of the Kaddish, that he's praying to God.
Are there variants
at the end.
Are there variants on the Kaddish that he's doing that strike you as, why did he move things this way, or why did he emphasize this or change that word?
The parallel, first of all, in the Kaddish is in Aramaic, and I couldn't, all I really know is that it's glorifying God, and that's, you say it for the dead. But here, there's no really direct parallels, except really at the end where he is saying that there's truth and there's God, and that's at the core of what the Kaddish is, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, that's what I meant when I said that the prayer at the end was referencing Jewish prayers. I was referring to Kaddish as well. Except at the very last line, I think, for that is the truth of it, that we all know God, that we know that we know that we know, also references both the Shema and the Baruch.
Yeah.
So we have to wait until the very last line of the book?
Yeah.
No, wait to the very last line for the religious aspect. But for the religious aspect, yeah. For Sammler to almost reveal to us what we have known all along, which is that he is Jewish. He's very Jewish, that he does believe in God, whether he may be embittered or whether he may be cynical about it or not, and that he believes that every human being has a contract, and that God has a contract with us. That's the other part of it. This is not a one-way street. It's like at the end, Sammler goes ahead and says, well, you knew this all along, or Bellow says it about him, but really, that's been there, that vase, and the fact too that he hasn't, there's no indication of him practicing in any way. But this indicates that he did practice, that he knows this prayer, and that that as a child, he may have been part of an observant family.
Despite the fact that he tells his nephew that he didn't attend synagogue all that much. I mean, I think from early on in the book, we get the impression of Mr. Sammler as having a Jewish background, but not one of observance to speak of. But he knew his background. He was very quick to visit Israel during the war, for several times, but in particular to be a witness for some reason, as if there is a potential second Holocaust in the works, and so to be a witness to that, which of course doesn't turn out that way. But so there are elements that are the culture of Judaism throughout. But I think that it's very good to point out the fact that the big reveal at the end that that there's something more than simply the cultural background.
And he would know this particular prayer, whether he had been an institutionally observant Jew or not, because this prayer would have been recited in his home. He would have been to occasions to other homes when there was a death, where the Kaddish would be recited. So
it's also incredibly primal. I mean, death is such a, I mean, it's an important, I know I'll say Kaddish for my parents, even though I'm not an observant Jew at all. I mean, it's just, you do it. I like this ending a lot.
It seems to me there's also a lot of the sense of community in how Dr. Brunner cares for the two of them. It's hard to think of other communities in which that would happen, that they would be supported for years.
That is also part of Judaism, the idea that it's your responsibility to take care of others.
You see that in Italian families and all kinds of other.
I think modern society is unfortunately moving away from that idea, and we scatter ourselves all over the world. We don't have a nuclear family structure as much as.
But Toby, you commented the contract, because that's a part of the prayer that we're referring to that maybe should be explained, which is that when somebody dies in the Jewish tradition, if you are the direct descendant, if you're the child, your responsibility is to recite Kaddish every day for a year. 11 months. And so that's a contract that you've entered into with the departed person and with God or whatever. So it's sort of a double layering again of that theme here. And so then my question is, what contract did Mr. Sammler fulfill in living his life? What was he doing? He now feels this obligation to groom. He's going to say Kaddish. Then since I get this, he's going to say Kaddish. He's going to say Kaddish for grooming.
I think that perhaps we might not want to push that too far, because if we're really looking at the obligations to say Kaddish, it's, I think, traditionally really spouses, children, parents, and siblings. Those are really the only relationships in which you're obligated to say it. So Sammler doesn't quite fit into any of those traditional
And I'm not sure his
positions,
kids
but
would,
I think
his
it's
kids
just
would.
because he knows his
as a
children
surrogate.
won't.
As a surrogate.
Yeah, he's a surrogate. Yeah. No, I was thinking back of contracts in general. What other contracts did, but it's pretty late to start that. Was he fulfilling?
That's a
Well,
toughie.
he goes back to Israel to get his daughter, which is to some extent, but he was sent there by the doctor. It was doctor's money that enabled it, and it was, I don't know.
But does he now have a contract with
The doctor.
The world.
Well, the world.
Because God rescued him from the Holocaust, and does he fulfill his contract?
Yeah.
Well, he feels, I mean, this shows you that he has a sense that such a concept exists. So if he feels that this guy, if he's making a judgment that this guy either met or did not meet, and in this case that he met this contract, I'm sure it's on his mind, although it would be hard to tease out whether that there is some sort of contract, and we don't really know if he feels he's meeting it or not.
I would be hesitant to push it too much in an optimistic sort of direction based on what we've read the whole time. I don't see Mr. Sammler getting up every morning to go to shul. But
No.
but
the idea of a
but-
contract is different, is not necessarily, I mean, its roots are in the religion, but
that root though is really the
it's a powerful moral.
cultural root as well. I mean, this is really the thing that marks the Jews out from everybody else as a nation. In speaking in a Hebrew Bible sort of way, that the nation of the Jews who are promised a territory and take it through force in the Hebrew Bible and continue to occupy it. But the point though is that the covenant between God and the Jews is something that is based in the nation, I think, the culture, as opposed to any sort of spiritual, like the contract
law.
It's law, that's right, but it's not necessarily a law that says you have to believe in me.
No, you
It's
have to do X,
certain
Y, and
acts.
Z. Yeah,
And those,
it is a contract.
Shall have no
But-
other God but me. That's not a requirement. I mean, there's so many, there's 612 commandments or something. Is that the right number? It's just, it goes on and on and on.
but you can't, and not all of those are going to be spiritual commandments. I mean, to not mix wearing cotton and wool together is not about belief in God, in my personal feeling, but it's defining you as a culture almost more than
It's a remembrance
spirit.
that that's what God wants you to do. Every time you do something that's a commandment,
Mhm.
then you are fulfilling something that is in some ways an obligation. It's a religious obligation. It's not necessarily a social obligation. We live all over the world, and we still have all those same beliefs, whether we're in China or Timbuktu or wherever. I mean, I think it's not cultural. I think it's religious. Not one where of so many cultures. I guess is part of my point. We live in every culture in the world, and we do assimilate to some extent. We're not Jews first and Americans second.
Don't some of those laws or rules or whatever, don't some of them fall into the spiritual category and some into the cultural category?
I have to really think on that one.
Really? Okay.
What do you think, Mabel?
Actually, I think Phil's probably has an opinion. What do you think, Phyllis? Do you think they fall into two different categories? You, Phyllis.
Me?
You, yeah, what do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do. I mean, that would seem logical to me.
Are the foods that you're not
But I
allowed
don't know.
to eat, are
Pardon
the
me?
foods that you're prohibited from eating, is that social or is that
I would say that was,
spiritual?
I would say that was cultural.
Except that you could not follow any of the rules and still consider yourself Jewish.
Right.
You might not even know
What all the
most of the
rules.
612 rules.
Right.
And but I agree with what you're saying, is that every time you do something, whether it's not eating, I don't know, meat and dairy, whether it's a big thing or a really little thing, you're reminding yourself why you're doing that.
Right.
And is that to remind yourself that you are religious, that this is a contract with God, or are you doing it because you're part of this community? I mean, it might be partly what your motivation is, but my feeling is that it just becomes part of who we are.
Well, and Jewish life is very dependent on community, even though ultimately a religious person would keep kosher, say, because it's commanded from God. It's very hard to keep kosher alone, say, in Missoula, Montana. You might be much more inclined to do it if you're living in Chicago and there's big Sabbath celebrations every week and everyone is singing and dancing. Then it's a whole different mood.
You mentioned that you considered yourself an American first and a Jew second, or the Jews.
I think
Is
so.
there-
I
Is it
don't-
too finite a question then to talk about the Hasidim or some of the more ultra-Orthodox, I know places in Brooklyn where they don't consider that they're really part of America, that they're part of their own little microcosm, and
I can't speak to that. I don't know how.
it's a question I don't know the answer to. And I'm
No, I
wondering
don't
if
either.
there's.
I think that theme might come up later in the series also when we start to look at different types of Jewish communities.
By the way, a lot of those religious not some of those religious people don't recognize the state of Israel.
Right.
Many do,
Yeah, I
many
know
do,
that too.
many do, but some think only God can establish. Right.
And
The
I've heard
Jewish
this
homeland.
also, that probably 60% of the Israelis are not what you consider observant Jews. They don't go to
They're
synagogue.
secular.
So that would be a more cultural, nationalistic association there.
It's very complicated.
I'm going to, I think that we're coming to an end, and the discussion has been fabulous, and I think that we've all really learned a lot from hearing other people's points of view. And I thought that I would just sort of leave us with one final question, since every word that we've already pretty much determined in the book is significant in some way. If you miss a word, then you might really get the wrong impression about something. So what then is the significance of Mr. Sammler's name, if in fact Sammler means collector? What is he collecting? It doesn't seem to be anything physical or material. What do you all think that the significance of Sammler's name is?
He's collecting memories and visions of whatever's going on, and he's very observant, and I think that's what he collects. He collects observation.
Observations and perceptions. Other.
He's collecting ideas about how to live and trying to sift through them.
Any other thoughts?
He collects an odd assortment of
Comrades.
They're mostly family
An odd
members.
assortment of comrades.
Yes,
The
he
folks
does.
around him. I don't think that's what they meant at the time.
No, but yeah. I think that he is sort of collecting these experiences and observations. Mr. Sammler seems to be someone who thrives on the observation, and he seems so bitter and critical at some times, but there's always something kind of at the root of his observation that seems like he is open to the idea that he's critical of, or skeptical of. I think skeptical might be a better word to describe it. So, for example, when this rude hooligan in the lecture hall comments on his age and his impotency and how he's irrelevant, I mean, he leaves, and he's curious about that sort of accusation. What on earth could have happened that my intellectual ideas could be confused with whether or not I am sexually viable or whatever. So he's clearly critical and observant, and he's collecting these things, but there seems to be a sort of openness also in his character. I would say that that's also one of the marks of the Jewish thought process, is the kind of the ability to grapple with conflicting ideas and willingness to engage them. I mean, so much of the Jewish religion depends on that sort of argumentation. So I think that is also, not only is he a collector of these ideas and observances and perceptions, but he's creating little debates in his head about them. But yeah.
And I think it's worth remembering that at the time Bellow wrote this book, his day job was being chair of the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. I think in some sense, Sammler is a collector of ideas and of modes of thought, modes of argument, kind of walking around propositions and seeing whether they're silly or not. And in fact, that list that you read, to begin with, that's stuff that reminds me of Chicago in 1970. And I think that it's something that it's a list of things that don't encourage thought. It's a list of things where people simply have stuff that they pick off the shelf and that's all they think about. Or more precisely, they don't have to think about it. And I think that what the rest of the book is doing is showing a different way of approaching ideas. And I think the example that you gave about him leaving the lecture at Columbia is just right. He could be crushed, he could be furious, and those would be plausible reactions. But in fact, he kind of wonders, is there anything to this, or is it really rubbish? And he entertains both possibilities.
Well, thank you all for coming out. I'm sure it was, a hard decision whether to go. And I heard these rumors that, Keith Richards was supposed to come and talk to us, but apparently not. But I think that we profited whether or not he was here. Anyway, thanks again for coming.
It was a great discussion.
It's hard to